Why is there such a huge gap between what we think parenting is going to be and what it actually is?
And women begin to internalize, I think, this sense that they have to be the ones who provide comfort, provide nurturing, look after people's feelings.
Why, when we have children, do we think it's going to bring us closer together, but often it really pushes us apart?
Precisely because we have raised our expectations of marriage, we won't stay in a marriage that doesn't meet the ideals that we have.
What are the jobs of mums and dads now?
Increasingly, egalitarian sharing of both the housework, the parenting, and the paid work is a predictor of closeness over time.
What's a dad when we're no longer just providers?
The word breadwinner didn't come into being until the 1820s. Before that, if a man described himself as the sole provider for his family, he was asking for sympathy because his wife was unable to contribute.
What's a mum when they often are?
It made women more dependent upon a husband who loved them rather than a husband who needed their labor in the home.
What am I supposed to teach or model for my children when I've no idea what the world is going to look like in 5 years' time? Why did my parents seem to have loads of conviction about these things and I have absolutely none? In this podcast, I talk with experts from all around the world about these problems and hopefully get some wisdom, some insight, and maybe most importantly, some perspective, and find out what it takes to be a happier parent. Stephanie Coontz is an author and historian who has been named as one of the most influential historians of the last decade. She's written a lot of books. They're focused on marriage, gender, and the family, most famously, Marriage: A History. She has an unbelievable depth of knowledge on this subject. So we take it right back to the Stone Age, and she charts a path of shifting expectations on the roles of men and women in relationships, right up to the present day and the issues we now face. We discuss how an understanding of this history can help us be kind to ourselves and our partners when we behave in the ways that we're just expected to, but also how understanding this history allows us the possibility of behaving differently. I learned so much from this wonderful lady. I hope you do too. I just want to go back as far as we possibly can, really, because I think we have this idea that we're just coming out of this breadwinner caregiver relationship into more of a dual breadwinner one. And I think certainly I was talking to my mum about it and she was like, well, it must just go back all the way to the Stone Age when, the women looked after the children and the men went out to hunt. But actually, what do we know about the Stone Age and family structures?
Well, what we know about the Stone Age is that a lot of what we've been told for years is just dead wrong. This idea that women needed to get a husband because that was the way they got fed and protected from wild animals. Which is kind of strange because, who protected them from wild animals while the men were out hunting then? That was always rang a little bell for me. But in fact, when we look at what we know about foraging societies that still exist and that have been recorded previously and put that together with the Paleolithic research, it suggests that, in fact, women did not need a husband to get food. There were other reasons for pair bonding. For a division of labor. For example, women tended not to go out to hunt a long distance. And that would make sense because if you've got a baby or you're menstruating, you don't want to go running off for 2 days on a hunt. But women contribute about half the calories. And the most important thing is in such societies, you don't need a husband to get a share. When a kill happens, the hunter who brought it down doesn't get an extra share. In fact, he doesn't usually even get the first helping of the meat. It's divided up and it's given to everyone in camp. And the noted anthropologist Sarah Hardy points out that they've done studies of such societies that still exist, and ones whose fathers never killed a single thing get just as many calories and weigh just as much as the kids whose fathers did kill a lot of things. So it turns out that this idea was totally wrong about what the invention of marriage was about. In fact, we think what marriage was all about really was getting in-laws. that it was a way of connecting bands that were separated with other bands and making connections and obligations. So as odd as that seems to us right now, the whole point of marriage was not the partner so much as the in-laws. And for thousands of years, that's how human beings seem to have lived, and most anthropologists agree. But to jump ahead to...
So basically what I think I read something you wrote where it's the creation of fictitious relations in a way. It's like you're making relatives who you aren't actually related to. That's kind of the point of marriage, right?
Right, right. And in band level societies that we know of today, they have a much broader definition of in-laws than we would today. Okay, so now your mother-in-law, but the mother-in-law's brother or wife or, those things are also considered to be relatives. So it was a way of recruiting networks of obligation and exchange. And of course, sharing is the most important human adaptation. It's what allowed them to survive. And so marriage was originally developed in order to increase sharing, which is tremendously ironic because then for thousands of later years, it began to be developed in order to limit sharing.
Explain. Okay, so I understand the first half. I really like that. What I got the image of there, when it's not just my brother-in-law or my mother-in-law, it's all their relatives. You're talking about in a traditional marriage these days, everyone from the other side of the church, right? Everyone sat on the other side because you have a bride side and a groom side. It's like, right now you're all my family. Okay, so I can understand how that works. Explain what you mean by it's used to limit sharing.
Well, once you begin to get inequalities in society, then the groups that have the most to have accumulated the most, they want to protect it. They don't want to share with just anybody. If I'm the one of those groups, I want my kid to marry into a group that is equally advantaged or more so. And at a certain point in history, very long ago, marriage becomes this manipulative tool to gain allies, to recruit followers, to merge fortunes. It's pretty much a business arrangement. And you do not want your kids marrying someone to whom you don't think you don't want to feel obligated, and you don't want to have obligations. So this is also the point at which you get a lot of control being exerted against young people's free choice, and particularly against women's free choice. Because if a woman marries or elopes with someone that you don't want to be connected to, but has a child, then you might find yourself mixed up with a group that you don't want to be connected to, which is why you get this tremendous control over women's fertility, concerns about their sexuality, and increasingly in many societies, for example, in England, a child born out of a marriage that was not approved by the parents could be broken up, and that child was a filius nullius, literally a child of no one, entitled to nothing. And it's really interesting because back in
sorry, are you not just a bastard, but it could be a marriage, but a marriage of which the parents don't approve?
Yes, those normally in many societies, if a children married somebody didn't approve, you could have the parents could have the marriage taken away. And other societies, they might.
Adding to that, we have the fact that you can't prove paternity, right? Until very, very recently, there's been no way to prove that someone is the father. So then we get this obsession, which is bound up in property and not feeling obliged to someone who you think actually has got no worth. We get this obsession with women's sexuality and controlling that.
Yes. And that's, this is an interesting point, because if we're interested in parenting, for example, there was an awful lot of sharing. For example, among the Hadza of Tanzania, babies were held by someone other than their mother by about 40% of the day. And I think it was the Eastern Congo group where it was 60% of the day, anthropologists found mothers would nurse each other's babies. As a matter of fact, was a new mom who knew about anthropology. That's the way I handled childcare with some of the women who had babies at the same time. So this was very common. But later on, as you get these inequalities and parents become more concerned to make sure that their daughters especially marry into families and marry men that they can use, as the anthropologist Sarah Hardy points out, women get less choice about deciding whether this would be a good partner for them or a good parent for their kids. And so you get a situation where men, I think it was Hardy who made this very important point, that not only does patriarchy subordinate women, but it separates men from babies. And that's something with very long-term consequences, which we can get into later, because it turns out that being involved with babies has tremendous impact on people's brains.
Why in yes, I mean I love Sarah Blether Hardy, and I've only read Father Time, which is an amazing book, but I just want, why in an arranged marriage is that the woman having no choice? If I'm told I have to go and marry this woman from another family because that's the family tie, surely both the individuals in that lack choice.
Well, I think that's really true. I don't think that we have emphasized enough how many young men were forced into marriages that they didn't really particularly want. On the other hand, because they could have babies out of wedlock that would not have a demand, that would not, the mother wouldn't be able to make a call on them. They weren't particularly bothered if the young men went off and had affairs, whereas they were very bothered if the woman forced into a marriage she didn't want had an affair.
Right. Yes, I can see that. So just talk to me about when does monogamy first show up? You described pair bonds, and obviously we've always coupled to have children, but when do we start kind of staying together in monogamous long-term couples?
There's a lot of debate about that, and there's a lot of variation. I mean, there have been societies where one man had several wives, could take several wives. There have been about 50 societies we know of where a woman could take more than one husband. Divorce is often very, very easy to get in band-level societies. But it's also true that there's always been long-term pair bonding, and whether, I have no idea whether it's built into our genes or not, but it's something that has always happened. It's not the only way people have organized it, but it seems to be a fairly common way, even if there are plenty of little lapses along the way.
Yeah, so there seems to be some kind of desire for long-term relationships, even if they're not monogamous, but some kind of long-term relationships that kind of exist outside of just rearing children, which I guess is like, really where I want to get to with the modern question. The UK and the US at the moment both have pretty similar divorce rates, around 40%. It's what does marriage mean now? And actually, do you, when you're studying this, when you're talking about this, do you differentiate between marriage and long-term monogamy?
Well, increasingly, if we look at the European situation, they don't. That you get plenty of couples that stay together for many, many years. Sometimes they'll get married after they've had 3 or 4 kids just to say, okay. But so it's a long-term monogamy. On the other hand, marriage continues to be, in most European and American people's minds, the most committed relationship that they can imagine. And there is still quite a bit of demand for that. And it's very interesting that whatever we say about the problems in marriage. Parents, for example, are much more approving of a relationship, same sex or different sex, if the kids marry rather than if they're just cohabiting. So there is something, and plenty of people can do without it, and that's fine. But we shouldn't deny the fact that a lot of people do still look for this.
Given the changes we've described, from it being about sharing and forming as wide a network as possible, a change to actually it being about not sharing and keeping your stuff. I love that. It's fascinating. Why do you think we do it now? Why do you think it has such importance? And what are people, in 2025, what are people looking for in marriage?
Well, this is one of the big changes, is that if we go back to like supposedly the golden age of marriage in the 1950s, it was based on a totally different situation between men and women. And it was between men and women since same-sex marriage was outlawed. And that was that you had a situation in both England and America and many other places where for the first time there really was a male breadwinner family. People have myths about how far back in history male breadwinning goes, and we can come back to that. But for the first time in history, it was possible for young men following World War II to actually support a family. And in this expanding economy, though, it was almost impossible for a woman to get access to the benefits of that expanding economy without marrying a breadwinner. So this is what the height of the breadwinner homemaker ideal. And for a long time, that stabilized marriage and was one of the goals the values that people put. As you know, that has changed, as you pointed out. The dual breadwinning is very, very common, and increasingly egalitarian sharing of both the housework, the parenting, and the paid work is a predictor of closeness over time. So we're wanting different things from marriage than we used to. And in many ways, we actually value it more. People say, when they look at the divorce rate and they say, well, people don't value marriage anymore. Actually, people don't feel that they have to stay in the institution anymore, but they value the relationship that they want from marriage much more than in the past. And actually, divorce rates have been going down quite a bit as people have begun to be able to negotiate. But the fact is, we will never have marriage as stable as it was when people had few alternatives outside it. Now, precisely because we have raised our expectations of marriage, we won't stay in a marriage that doesn't meet the ideals that we have.
That's such a good point. That actually, we're saying people care less about marriage, but no, there's no fault divorce exists now. The fact that we're still doing it, and divorce, like, people value marriage much more highly when they stay in it.
Yes, exactly.
That's incredible. Like, I was listening to Esther Perel, I can't remember. I think she was talking with Simon Sinek, and they were comparing how the workplace and relationships have changed. And actually now, your job isn't just about, for some people on certain income levels, isn't just about providing and surviving. You expect to get meaning and reward from it in different ways. And the same has happened in these relationships. So now relationships are this place where it's like, actually, is this a good environment for me to actualize?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't made that connection between our expectations of work and our expectations of marriage. But yes, and of course, precisely because we have raised our expectations of work, despite the degradation of work that's going on in some modern economies, we have raised our aspirations for fulfillment. And that has, it's made marriage a more difficult journey than it used to be, a more rewarding one, but also a more risky one.
Okay, so tell me then, you said we'll go back to when we first get this idea of the breadwinner. You said that the post-Second World War was actually the first time that a man could just completely support a family on one wage. Where does this idea of the male breadwinner first come? Where do we first encounter it?
Well, that's so interesting, I think. We look back at aristocratic patriarchy, for example, and that, there are a lot of misconceptions about that. I mean, it was terrible. I mean, men had control over women, but social rank outweighed gender yes, if you and I were of the same rank, I would have to be subordinate to you. But if you were lower rank than me, then you would step out of my way and lower your eyes when I walk down the street. And so there was not this idea that men supported women. Women were supposed to be subordinate to men who were either their equal or above them, but women who were powerful. Well, let me give you a good example. The prefix Mrs. didn't used to refer to a woman's married status. It used to refer to her social status. And if you were a Mrs., short for mistress, the equivalent of master or mister, you were called Miss. You were called Mrs. even if you weren't married. That was an honorific. It's only in democratic capitalism that we begin to get the Mrs. being extended to the wives of men who were misters, and it's referring to their marital status. So when we look,
would I be a mister regardless of my sort of social level, or did I have to sort of own property or something to be a mister?
Not in patriarchy, no. In fact, when we look at the records of different towns, only like about 14 or 15% of the men listed are called misters. They're the masters. They're the ones you have to defer to, and Mrs.
Landowners.
was the one you had to defer to. Yeah.
Interesting.
Here in patriarchy, then what you have is this situation where there's tremendous acceptance of inequality and domination, but ironically, it's when you get the spread of democratic capitalism that offers men the opportunity to be not only to work for wages independently of the old kind of feudal relations, but suggests to them that you can actually, you can have an identity as brothers, that we're all created equal. Well, that's what happens there is women are offered an identity as wives and mothers in ways that were not traditional, And if you were in the 14th, 15th century, the word breadwinner didn't come into being until the 1820s. Before that, if a man described himself as the sole provider for his family, he was asking for sympathy because his wife was unable to contribute. Wives then were considered yokemates and meat helps. They were subordinate. They were like the second in command. They were subordinate to their husband, but they were not considered to be helpless, and the men were not considered to be the sole breadwinners.
Right. They weren't a dependent.
No, well,
although
I
suppose the same could be said for children, right? We used to have children to work for us as opposed to them being a net cost, I suppose.
Yes. And in fact, in those days, if you were a family that had some property, even a small farm, the woman and the man worked together to raise the food, to take the cow to market. We have women took the cows to market very often. They didn't wait for the men to bring home the bacon. They helped butcher the pig and make the bacon. And it was kids then who did the work. Kids or young servants, girls who were not yet married, who did the work around the house that later became women's work. Women's work used to be much more productive. So
then, what happens in 1820 that changes this?
Well, there's not there's not a complete date change at the time.
No, but I'm wondering what instigates this change, and is this the time where we start to get this romanticized ideal of the mother?
Completely. As you develop the market economy that goes beyond just the barter with neighbors and stuff, and you get the development of wage labor, people, first, for one thing, that one good side of it is, if you're a kid who wants to get married to someone that you actually love, which has been, like a fantasy, but something that wasn't always attainable. You no longer have to wait for your parents to inherit, to say you can have your share of the farm, or if you're a woman, their dowry. You can go out and get a job and save up and get married. So marrying for love became more possible, and it became more of an ideal as people developed new democratic ideals. The market economy was originally favored a lot of individualism. It's gone to another extreme since then. But as it developed, it began to help people formulate ideas that you ought to be able to go to work where you want to go to work, to leave a job or to land if you want to leave it. They can work for wages and not have to be dependents of the people who employ them and obey them. They can say, okay, well, at work I obey you, and when I'm off work I do not obey you. So it spread this idea of, individual choice, and to be able to choose your friends and your family and your wife or your husband. And that became a new idea.
But then what happens is basically this idea of getting a job allows this freedom of men. They can we can all marry for love. We can marry who we want. But the freedom of mothers is curtailed because we're becoming more individualistic and mothers are left on their own more. What's happening there?
Well, very important part of it, of course, is that women become more dependent on their husbands than they used to be. And, it used to be that when you look at what wives did around the home in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, husbands knew they could boss them around, but they also knew that they could not get on without them, But once you have a situation where there are very limited job opportunities for women and men are going and earning the wages, well, a wife's role is still very important because especially in the early days, there wasn't a consumer economy. You had to, if you bought flour, it would still have a lot of stones in it. If you couldn't buy ready-made clothes. So women's work became much more privatized. It was something that you did your husband brought home the raw materials and you finished them off. And so you were very much more dependent upon your husband's purchasing power. I'm please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the old way was egalitarian, but in some ways it made women more dependent upon a husband who loved them rather than a husband who needed their labor in the home. And women begin to internalize, I think, this sense that they have to be the ones who provide comfort, provide nurturing, look after people's feelings in ways that, looking at the diaries of women, oppressed though they may have been in the Middle Ages, I'm not sure that they felt. And this, there are all sorts of new ways of loving and impossibilities for real mutual love in these relationships. But it also creates a situation where women's self-image, unlike men's, begins to depend more and more upon being able to inspire love and being able to provide those comforts and cheering and solace for the people who work outside the home. And that becomes internalized in ways that we still see playing out, even those of us who have become very independent, that we're the ones who do the emotion work, the cognitive labor around that.
Yeah, because what struck me there is that actually most households now can't survive without two incomes, even though we're all working for other people and jobs exist. So we need women again for those things, and yet they're stuck being the people who it's important for them to do all the nurture and look after our feelings. That hasn't shifted despite the fact that we now need them to do this other work.
Yeah. And, it goes both ways. Men have learned to expect this of women. I mean, I don't think many men don't even realize that it's emotional work. They just think that, their wives are just good at this. Naturally, they don't realize you have to work at being good at this. But we women, we have internalized it too. And so we do maybe more of that emotional work than we need to. And we feel very much obligated to be the ones who take care of that around the house. And then it's reinforced by the fact that, there's so few supports, especially once children arrive.
I just want to go, this may not go anywhere, but I'm sort of intrigued by the fact that in certainly classical antiquity, which is just a period of history I know a bit more about, there is this connection of woman as homemaker. You would always have a goddess of the home or the hearth, never a god. That does seem to have been there, and this classical connection between women and the home.
Well, yeah, but you're talking mostly about the heritage from slave societies, where slave women didn't count. It was upper class women who were able to stay home or forced to stay home, however you want to put it.
Right. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's a strata of society we're talking about again. Your book that is coming out soon, you're focusing on, the big question for this podcast, really, which is about what does having children do to couples, and what are the transitions, the difficult transitions that couples go through when they have kids?
Well, there are some people who still prefer to do the kinds of female homemaker, female child raiser, and male provider. But we have increasingly found that it's more egalitarian relations and division of labor that makes people happy nowadays. This is the greatest satisfaction, both sexual and emotional, that you find in couples, as reported by those couples who share things fairly equally. And
just to jump in there, we both genders profess that that's important to them. I think I've read you writing that somewhere.
Yes, they do. And also when you actually take polls, like many of the researchers that I know in the Council on Contemporary Families actually ask questions about this, and they find that the people who are most satisfied with their relationships are the ones who share, who know what each other do. One very interesting finding that has always struck me is the ones who say they divide the tasks equally are less satisfied than the ones who share or alternate it. And I think that's because when you share or alternate, you know that you're doing, you know what the other one does. If you're dividing the tasks in that old-fashioned way of, or what became old-fashioned way in the 19th and 20th centuries, there are certain female tasks and there are male tasks, and you don't know what's involved in the other one. It's really interesting to me that the studies that show that people are happiest when they have done the others and sometimes do the other tasks and they share those, because then okay, we're doing about the same thing. So this couples who are married today who don't have kids seem to be getting much, much better at sharing the tasks or alternating them in ways that are very fair. But when the child arrives, that changes. And sometimes it changes because the woman is the one we're socialized to feel more guilty if we're not staying home with the kid. And the men are socialized to feel more guilty if they're not making money. But more often it happens just because it makes sense for the woman to stay home, that you can't divide equally the amount of work that is full-time wage earning and taking care of a child. And it makes sense biologically if the woman had the baby. She needs time to recover from that. She may be nursing. She also feels more likely to be socialized to feel guilty if she goes back to work too soon, whereas the man feels guilty if he cuts back too soon from work. So all those things make perfect, plausible, logical sense for the women to start off at home. But then there's this kind of creeping thing that happens. On the one hand, the arrangement limits women's opportunities for advancement and movement forward in the workplace, but it also limits men's opportunities for advancement and knowledge at home. And women can quickly turn into the expert and be treated as the expert by other people and see themselves as the expert. I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who once felt compelled to write a note to the school guidance counselor saying, "This child has two parents. Please alternate calls." So all of
Mm.
these things then create a situation where two people who have come into this wonderful experience of parenthood with expectations of sharing the load, it begins to change where the woman takes more and more of it, the man um, does less and less. Well, he probably does more, but he's doing less and he's learning less than the woman is. And that begins to widen the difference between them. And it's a major source of unhappiness in modern marriages.
Yeah, um, all my friends, obviously, polls and studies into this stuff are always fascinating. But I think, we can just intuitively feel that that is true. That, I don't know any of my friends, regardless of what their sort of financial setup is and what their work looks like, who aren't going through that widening and that resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting you talked about, the guilt of the mum in not looking after the kid and the guilt of the dad in not being the breadwinner. And I think that's why this deep historical work you do is actually really powerful. Because if I can look at my situation and be like, it's not always been like this. There's nothing inherently right in this model. I don't have to feel guilty about not seeking my value just in one area. I can start to reject it and maybe choose what I feel guilty about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And one of the things I talk about in the new book is that also makes it more possible, if you have that kind of historical perspective, not to blame yourself or your partner that they're bad people. You can understand, okay, they've been socialized this way. And, to understand everything is certainly not to forgive everything, but it makes a lot more possible to change things because you can come at it from the idea of this isn't a bad person. This is, and I'm not a bad person, but we've both been socialized in ways that we really need to break these habits. And it's going to take time. Doesn't happen overnight. Use the example in the book, women often complain about men's learned helplessness, that they'll say, well, I do want to help, but I don't know how to do it, or they won't do it quite right. So the woman ends up saying, or he'll say, I'll clean it up later. And she gets so annoyed that she cleans it up. And then she
God.
gets
Oh,
even more
wow.
annoyed.
That one all the time in this house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll do it. Well, now you've done it, so I won't do it, obviously.
Yeah, and it's even more annoying, I think, when the guy says, well, I was going to get to it, But I have to tell you the other side. It's important for us women to recognize the other side of it. It's funny because I have a grandchild now that's slowed down. That's one reason the book took me a little longer than I expected when I signed the contract to write it. And there's this tendency among us women to think that we know the household routines and the baby routines better than men. And I've been telling it, it's called gatekeeping by sociologists, that will say, okay, we know how to do this, and you have to do it our way. And you don't, we'll step in and tell you how to do it better if you're not doing it. And it's funny, I've been lecturing about this for years, but the first time that our infant grandson started to wail and he was in the living room with my husband, I swooped in and took the baby out of his hands. I got an immediate lesson about how that made him feel, which was not good. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't help myself. Knowing all that I do about these histories, I couldn't help myself. I just grabbed it. So knowing this history makes it more possible. I mean, he was pissed off at me, but knowing that history makes it more possible for us to say, yeah, but she did this because she's been socialized to do it. And for me to say, I know you're pissed off at me and I probably will do it again occasionally, but I'm going to try really hard not to do it because I know that it's irritating.
So yeah, I guess I just 2 points to make about that. One is just 100% knowing these things allow us to not make the other person or ourselves bad. And I think someone asked me on another podcast the other day, like, what have you, apart from having a happier partner, what have you got out of this work? And, in the same way that me researching this stuff has allowed me to see all the things that I hadn't been doing, it's also allowed my wife to understand why that's the case. And it's not that I'm a bad person or a lazy person. I think there's this temptation to say 50% of the population are lazy right now. It's a pretty crazy thing to say. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's really interesting. And then also, with that example of the swooping in Sarah Blather Hardy's Father Time, she talks about, some of Darwin's work, which suggested that men could be nurturers, that he was kind of onto it, and it was just never the bit that really filtered through. And he gives this example, I think, of a rooster, some kind of wild chicken, after the mother, I think, probably dies, sitting on the eggs. And he comes to the conclusion that actually, I think the phrase he uses is, all nature is, of course, hermaphrodite. But the point is, nature also runs on efficiency, and the rooster would never have done that had the mum been around. And, there does have to be this reason for men to learn the skills. I think we're getting better at that. I'm looking at my mates, and their wives go away more often and leave the men alone with babies. But that does need to be there.
Well, that's why we need paternity leave, real paternity leave, because it gives them the experience of doing that. And I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is this new research that shows that spending a lot of, and I think Sarah Hardy talks about it too, that spending time with babies literally changes people's brains. I was fascinated by the fact that, first of all, it, increases the production of oxytocin, the love hormone. It decreases aggression. It streamlines the brain. The researchers say it actually makes it a little smaller, but that's actually more efficient because it's concentrating more on the baby.
We get rid of some useless bits.
And the one that really got to me, that I just think is a fascinating finding, is that the downside for men is it tends to make them more anxious and sleepless, the way we've always blamed on women's more emotional state. But because they are caring more about the baby, they have that downside that women have had for so long. I think that's lovely.
God, that's so lovely, because also, I think there's so much of that, the widening that you described in marriage when we have children, is actually that the mums are just being like, I'm suffering. Why aren't you suffering? Can you suffer with me as well? And I know that sounds like a negative thing, but actually sometimes that's what relationship is. It's like, you're suffering, I'm going to suffer with you. Whereas I think for a lot of us, fatherhood is all brilliant. And it's like, what's your problem? Chill out.
Right.
What do you mean you're not sleeping? But it's because we're not leaning in to go through those changes.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah.
I don't know if you've thought about this at all, but you talk about the fact that now we spend more time out of marriage. And I think you're talking about the fact that we marry later. So we're married for a kind of shorter period of time. But I just wonder about the fact that we're so connected now, and that for my parents' generation, they would go off to work and have no contact, they both work, but they would have no contact all day. And now my wife and I are having interactions every hour, in one way or another, back and forth. And I wonder what that's changed about what these kind of relationships are.
Well, that's one of the good sides of, the social media that we've got. So much of it disconnects us from other people. You go into a line or a waiting room where normally, and I'm old enough to remember when you started talking to people, and nowadays they're all just on their phones. In fact, and it's a real problem. because it turns out that those little minor interactions, social interactions that we have with people are very consequential for our well-being and our ability to relate to others. So it's great that you're doing it with your wife. It's too bad that that has become so much of a substitute for doing it with other people. It's funny, I told my husband this research about how important it is to one's mood to have these little interactions with people. And he said that, all right, so he tried it out in grocery lines a couple times. And he said, you're right. It just lifts everybody's mood. And so that's one of the good parts of social media. And let's make it go beyond our marriages.
Yeah, I love that. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about around this gendered piece of where we are right now and how you see things kind of getting better for couples?
Well, as you can probably tell by the way we've talked, I'm not a hetero pessimist. I think that I'm very happy that we have same-sex relationships because there's so much that heterosexual couples can learn from those same-sex relationships now that they're out in the open and we can study them. For example, they're much more flexible and creative than most heterosexual couples are about how they decide to divide up the chores. But, I just think that we have to understand, going back to what we were talking about earlier, how much both men and women have been deformed, or that maybe that's too strong a word, but have just been kind of injured by the kind of stereotypes and expectations, very narrow expectations and very narrow ideas of our own capacities that we have been taught or not taught. And that it's just so important to remember that we all have these capacities and we can build on them. Now, there's a lot of things to be pessimistic about in this world, including the extraordinary, problems with the planet and the fact that billionaires seem to be taking over, making many of the political decisions. There are better ways to focus our anger and our discontent than on each other. Yes, that's the bottom line.
Yeah, beautiful. Just as an example of that kind of how hamstrung we are by these gendered expectations, me doing all this work, posting about it every day. Still, this weekend, I am going to attempt to fix and put up a fence, right? I am just terrible at that stuff, but the idea of getting Eloise to do it and I don't know, my neighbours seeing my wife outside, who's probably better at it than me, but like out in the rain trying to hammer a fence in. I can't. Do you know what I mean? It's really hard to not fall into these things. I'm not the one who should be building that fence, but men are. So I'm going to end up doing it, My last question, I just wonder, I feel like religious texts and philosophy, a lot of which stems from religion, but not all, have very little to say about what we get from pair bonding, whether that be marriage or just monogamous relationship. This thing that, as you described, does seem very important to humans. I like what wisdom have you found around it? Because I feel like we all just get sort of treated as individuals by religion and philosophy.
Well, if you look, for example, at the New Testament, one of the most interesting things about it is that it asks us to be, it asks believers, and it in Christianity, to become part of a larger community, not as just individuals, but also not just as marriage. I mean, one of the things that always makes me laugh is people who think that Christian values really elevate marriage and the family above all else. In fact, marriage was the second best state. Staying single, childless cat ladies would have been preferable, to use Vance's description of unmarried women, because it wasn't just the sex hang-ups. It was also, at least when we look at Jesus's where Jesus is quoted. It was because you should be concerned with the broader community, and you should build a brotherhood and even a sisterhood too in a few of the Gospels that would involve more than just your individual relations. I don't think that I by no means devalue those individual coupled relationships, but I think that those coupled relationships do better when we are trained to look outside them and understand that we actually strengthen our couple relationships when we go out and expand our interactions with others and our concerns for others. One of the big problems with marriage as it's been in England and America since the 1950s is this idea that it's just the two of you. And it turns out that married couples actually spend less time than single people with their relatives and talking to friends. And it should be the opposite of that. Marriage should be the way that you, like back in Paleolithic times, that you gain new contacts outside the family. Okay, now I can see your friendship networks and your relative networks, and we can all expand our contacts.
I loved an article I read by you talking about Valentine's Day, and actually, yes, going for a romantic dinner for two, possibly greater if you're in the new throes of love, but actually couples report greater satisfaction and love for each other when they go out on a double date with another couple.
Or not even a double date, just with socializing with other friends. Yeah.
I hope you got as much out of that as I did. Stephanie has written a lot of books, but her upcoming one is called For Better and Worse, The Complicated Past and Challenging Future of Marriage. I'll put a link to pre-order that in the show notes. You can also find many of our articles at stephaniecoontz.com. Please like, subscribe, leave a review for the podcast, and follow me at Be a Happier Parent on Instagram and TikTok. I'll see you all next week.